Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're diving deep into something that I think a lot of us struggle with, that feeling of being stuck in a victim loop,
Yeah,
replaying, those moments where we felt betrayed or mistreated over and over and over. It's tough stuff. And you've let us know that you're really looking for ways to move past this.
right.
So we're turning to Eckhart Tolle today
Yeah, great source.
to hopefully unpack this a little bit and give you the tools that you need to escape that cycle.
Absolutely. And I commend you for even taking these steps to address it. It's a very common experience to feel stuck there and to want to break free.
Absolutely. It's so easy to dwell on those negative thoughts, and sometimes it feels almost impossible to break free. So Tolle talks about this concept of the deep I. What exactly is that, and how does it help us escape this victim loop?
The deep I, it's interesting, we often tend to identify with that surface level of ourselves, our
Mhm.
personality, our thoughts and feelings.
Right.
He calls this the surface I. But there's this deeper level of awareness within each of us that he refers to as the deep I. It's that source of our true selves, beyond all those fleeting emotions and thoughts.
Okay, so it's like having this deeper, wiser part of ourselves that can observe those negative thoughts without getting completely swept away by them, almost like an inner observer of sorts.
Exactly. And by tapping into that deep I, we gain a new perspective.
hmm
We can see that those thoughts and feelings are just that thoughts and feelings. They don't define us.
Okay, I'm starting to see how that shift in perspective could be really powerful, but how do we actually access this deep I in our everyday lives?
Well, it starts with awareness, noticing when we're falling into that victim mentality, that cycle of blaming others and resentment.
Right.
For example, imagine you're stuck in traffic and you start feeling that anger rising up.
Oh, yeah.
The deep I allows you to step back and observe that anger without judgment. Recognize it's there, but you don't have to let it control you.
So instead of getting caught up in that emotion and letting it kind of ruin my whole day,
Yeah.
I can just acknowledge it's there and
Ah,
choose to not let it dictate my mood.
exactly. You got it. That's the power of the deep I. It
Yeah.
gives you that space to choose your response rather than just reacting.
This is fascinating. Now, you mentioned blame and resentment there. Tolle also talks about how a lot of human behavior stems from what he calls unconsciousness. I gotta admit, I'm a little fuzzy on how that fits into all of
Okay.
this. Can you clarify that a little bit?
Yeah. So unconsciousness is basically the idea that we often act out of these deeply ingrained patterns, these conditionings, without even realizing it.
hmm
It's like we're on autopilot. We react from old wounds and beliefs without any conscious thought.
Yeah.
And this lack of awareness can lead us to actions that hurt both ourselves and other people.
So it's not necessarily that people are intentionally trying to be hurtful, they're just operating from this unconscious space.
Precisely. And Tolle gives a very personal example to illustrate this. He talks about his own father who had these anger issues stemming from his own childhood.
Hmm.
And, he says his father wasn't choosing to be angry. He was just reacting unconsciously based on his past.
Wow. That's such a powerful illustration. It really makes that concept come to life a little bit. But then how do we move from understanding this to forgiveness? Because if someone hurts you deeply, even if it wasn't intentional, it can still be so hard to let go of that resentment.
You're right, it is hard. And it brings us to Tolle's interpretation of this powerful phrase, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He's suggesting that understanding this idea of unconsciousness can be a vital first step toward forgiveness.
So it's about recognizing that sometimes people are just acting out of these ingrained patterns, not out of any malice.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not about condoning the behavior or letting people off the hook. It's about understanding these deeper forces at play, which can help loosen the grip of that resentment that you're feeling.
So understanding can lead to forgiveness. But what about accountability? I mean, does understanding someone's unconsciousness absolve them of the consequences of their actions?
That's where it gets really interesting, and I'm sure you're thinking that too. Because while understanding this might help us forgive, it absolutely does not negate the impact of their actions or excuse any harmful behavior.
Right.
People are still responsible for their choices, even if those choices are driven by unconscious patterns.
So there's a distinction between understanding why someone might have acted the way they did and holding them accountable for the harm that they actually caused.
Absolutely. That's an important distinction to make. Forgiveness and accountability can, and perhaps should, exist side by side.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It really helps reframe things, but let's be honest, it's still really tough, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about really deep personal hurts and letting go of that pain. What are some practical steps that we can take to actually start breaking free from this victim loop?
Well, one of the most powerful tools that Tolle emphasizes is mindfulness. It's about paying attention to our thoughts and feelings in the present moment without judgment.
So instead of getting swept away by those negative thought patterns, we learn to observe them with a sense of detachment,
Yeah,
almost like watching clouds drift by.
exactly. And in that space of observation, we start to gain some control over how we actually respond to those thoughts. We realize that we have a choice.
Okay, so awareness is key. But how do we actually cultivate that mindfulness? Is it about meditation? Are there any other exercises or practices that we can try?
Meditation is definitely one powerful tool for developing mindfulness. It's like training our minds to be more present and less reactive.
Yeah.
But mindfulness can be practiced in so many ways, even in everyday moments.
Mm.
For example, try bringing your full attention to really simple activities like washing the dishes or taking a walk,
Okay.
anything.
So it's about finding those moments of stillness and awareness throughout the day, not just during, a formal meditation practice.
Precisely. And by bringing this awareness into our lives, we start to shift from feeling like victims of our circumstances to becoming empowered individuals who can choose how we respond to those challenges.
Yeah.
And, one thing that can keep us stuck in that victim loop is this belief that we need someone else to acknowledge the harm they've caused before we can move on.
Oh, I've been there.
Yeah.
It's like we're waiting for them to validate our pain before we can even allow ourselves to heal.
And it can be so disempowering because we're essentially handing over our healing to the very person who hurt us.
That's a really good point. So how do we break free from that need for that external validation?
It goes back to cultivating that deep eye awareness.
Okay.
We learn to validate our own experiences and emotions.
Mm.
We acknowledge the pain, allow ourselves to feel it, but we don't let it define us.
So instead of seeking that validation from the outside, we turn inward and we offer that compassion and understanding to ourselves.
Exactly. And that can be so incredibly liberating because we're no longer dependent on someone else's actions or apologies
Mhm.
to find peace.
Sometimes I find myself holding on to anger because it feels like it's the only way to get justice. It's like if I forgive, then the person who hurt me wins.
It's a very common feeling. But Tully challenges us to consider whether clinging to that victim identity is truly serving us.
Right.
It might feel like we're getting even, but is it actually bringing us any closer to healing or happiness?
You know what? Thinking about it now, it almost feels like holding on to that anger is a way of punishing myself.
Yeah.
It's me who's carrying all that weight around, not the other person.
That's the paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
We often think we're punishing the other person by holding on to resentment, but in reality, we're the ones that are suffering.
Yeah.
Forgiveness, on the other hand, is about freeing ourselves from that burden.
So how do we even begin to forgive when the hurt feels so deep and raw? Are there specific steps we can take to kind of make that process a little easier?
Well, it's important to remember that forgiveness is a process, not a switch we can just flip on.
Right.
It takes time, and it's not always linear. There will be days when those feelings of anger and resentment resurface, and that's okay.
Sure.
The key is to just keep coming back to that deep eye awareness, that place of non-judgmental observation.
So what are some practical techniques that we can use to actually cultivate forgiveness?
One practice that can be really helpful is journaling.
Okay.
Write down your feelings, explore the root of your anger and resentment. Sometimes simply expressing those emotions on paper can help release their intensity.
That's a great idea. I've always found journaling to be really helpful for processing emotions.
Yeah.
What about practicing empathy? Can that play a role in forgiveness?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Try to see the situation from the other person's perspective.
Okay.
Now, this doesn't mean condoning their actions, but it can help you understand the factors that might have contributed to their behavior, including their own unconscious patterns.
So it's about trying to understand the person behind the action, even if that action itself was hurtful.
Exactly, and that understanding can then open the door to compassion, which is a key ingredient in forgiveness.
This is all so helpful.
Okay.
I'm already starting to feel a shift in perspective just by talking about this.
That's great.
It's like a weight is starting to lift off my shoulders.
It's amazing how just becoming aware of these patterns and these concepts can create such a powerful shift.
Okay, so we've talked about forgiveness, we've talked about accountability, but what about taking responsibility for our own happiness? I mean, if we've been stuck in this victim loop for a while, it can be really easy to feel like our happiness is dependent on external factors, like
Yeah.
whether or not the person who hurt us apologizes or changes their behavior.
That's a crucial point, and Tolle emphasizes that while we can't control the actions of other people, we do have control over how we respond to them and how we choose to live our lives.
So it's about shifting our focus from what happened to us to how we actually want to move forward.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our sense of self isn't solely defined by past experiences. It's about reclaiming our power and choosing to create a life filled with joy and purpose, regardless of what's happened in the past.
Which leads to a fascinating question. If our sense of self isn't fixed, and we're not solely defined by our past, how can we actively shape our identity in the present moment? How do we become the authors of our own stories, so to speak?
That's a brilliant question, and one that gets to the heart of Tolle's teachings.
Yeah, it does. It really does feel like we have the power to write our own stories, but it can feel daunting, especially if we've been carrying those old narratives of, victimhood for a long time.
Right.
Where do we even begin to rewrite those stories?
Well, Tolle talks about the power of the present moment.
Okay.
He believes that the only place where we truly have agency is right now, in this very moment. It's in the now that we can make those conscious choices that align with who we want to be.
So it's not about, trying to craft some perfect future self.
Right.
It's about making those small conscious choices each and every moment that reflect the person we're becoming.
Exactly. And those choices might seem insignificant at first,
Right.
but over time, they have this cumulative effect.
Can you give some examples of those small conscious choices?
Absolutely. It could be as simple as choosing to respond to a frustrating situation with patience instead of anger, or choosing to focus on the good in your life
Mm.
instead of dwelling on the negative,
Hmm.
or choosing to offer a kind word to a stranger instead of rushing by in indifference.
Yeah, it's like those tiny everyday moments where we actually have the opportunity to choose a different path, a path that leads us closer to the person we want to be.
Precisely. And those choices become the brushstrokes that paint the canvas of our lives.
I love that analogy. It's like we're the artists of our own lives.
And we have this vast palette of colors to choose from.
Yeah.
We can choose to paint our lives with colors of joy, compassion, creativity, resilience. It's all up to us.
This is so inspiring, but I have to admit it also feels a little bit overwhelming. Like, what if I mess up?
Yeah.
What if I make the wrong choices?
That's where self-compassion comes in.
Okay.
We're all human. We're all going to make mistakes along the way. The key is to not beat ourselves up when we stumble.
Right.
We simply acknowledge the misstep, learn from it, and then course correct. It's about progress, not perfection.
So it's a continual process of learning and growing. And I imagine that takes a lot of courage, right? To let go of those old familiar narratives and kind of embrace the unknown.
It does. It takes courage, but it's also incredibly liberating. When we release those limiting beliefs about who we are, we open ourselves up to a whole world of possibility. We become free to explore different aspects of ourselves,
Yeah.
to try new things, step outside our comfort zones.
Yeah, it's like we're finally free to write our own stories, not the ones that have been written for us by our past experiences or the expectations of others.
Exactly. We reclaim our power, our agency, and our ability to create a life that truly reflects who we are and who we want to be.
This has been such an enlightening conversation. I feel like I'm walking away with a whole new toolkit for breaking free from that victim mentality and creating a more empowered and fulfilling life. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise with us today.
It was my pleasure. I hope that this deep dive has given you some valuable tools and perspectives as well.
And for our listeners, I'll leave you with one final thought to ponder. If we're not defined by our past experiences or the labels others might place upon us, what does it truly mean to be the authors of our own lives? What kind of story do you want to write? Until next time, keep diving deep, embrace the power of the present moment, and remember, you are the author of your own extraordinary story.
That's beautiful.